Yeah, he was gone for like 3 nights in a row.
On a cold December night in 1984, 12-year-old Jonelle Matthews came home from a Christmas concert. Less than 2 hours later, her father walked into the house. Jonelle was gone. Her shoes were still inside. There was no note, no clear reason for her to leave. And outside, in the fresh snow, investigators found footprints around the family home. Then the trail went cold. For nearly 35 years, no one could say for certain where Jonelle was or what had happened to her. But in 2019, workers digging in an empty field made a discovery that changed the case completely. And what happened next was even more unexpected, because investigators soon focused on a man who had spent years talking about Jonelle's disappearance. A man who once said he knew more than he wanted to know. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why his own words became so important. This is the story of Jonelle Matthews. Jonelle was 12 years old and lived with her family in Greeley, Colorado. She was the adopted daughter of Jim and Gloria Matthews, and she had an older sister named Jennifer. Jonelle was a student at Franklin Middle School. She was active, well known in her community, and she loved to sing. And on December 20th, 1984, just 5 days before Christmas, Jonelle performed at a holiday concert. It should have been an ordinary night. After the concert, Jonelle got a ride home with a friend and the friend's father. They arrived at her house shortly after 8 p.m. But when Jonelle got home, no one else was there. Her mother was away visiting family. Her father was at her older sister's basketball game. So Jonelle entered the house alone. The man who drove her home watched her go inside before leaving. At that moment, everything seemed normal. But it would become the last confirmed sighting of Jonelle Matthews. Later that night, her father returned home. And almost immediately, something felt wrong. Jonelle was nowhere to be found. At first, there were simple possibilities. Maybe she had gone to a friend's house. Maybe there had been some misunderstanding. But as her father looked around, those explanations became harder to believe. Jonelle's shoes were still inside the house. There was no note explaining where she had gone. And there was no clear reason for a 12-year-old girl to suddenly disappear into a freezing December night. Then came the detail that made the situation even more disturbing. Outside the house, there were footprints in the snow. Investigators examined the area around the home. Some reports from the case would later focus on tracks near the property and signs that parts of the scene may have been disturbed. But none of it answered the most important question. Where was Jonelle? Her family searched. Police were called. And what began as a normal night before Christmas quickly became a missing child investigation. The timing made the disappearance especially difficult to understand. Jonelle had just performed at a Christmas concert. She had been driven home safely. Someone had watched her walk into the house. And then, within a relatively short window of time, she vanished. There was no confirmed explanation for what happened next. As days passed, the search grew. Police followed leads. Her family waited for news. Her photograph was shared publicly. But Jonelle did not come home. Weeks became months, and the case began attracting attention far beyond Greeley. This was during an era when missing children were becoming part of a major national conversation in the United States. Jonelle's image became associated with missing child campaigns, including the milk carton era, when photographs of missing children were printed and distributed in the hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize them. Her disappearance even reached the White House. In 1985, President Ronald Reagan mentioned Jonelle while drawing attention to the issue of missing and exploited children. Think about how extraordinary that was. A 12-year-old girl from Colorado had disappeared. Her name had reached the President of the United States. Her face had been seen far beyond her hometown. And still, her family had no answer. No one could tell them where she was. No one could bring her home. And no one had been held responsible. As the years passed, Jonelle's case slowly became cold. Investigators continued to receive information. Different possibilities were considered. But the central mystery remained. Jonelle had entered her home on December 20th, 1984. And then she was gone. For her family, the passing years created a painful kind of uncertainty. Without finding Jonelle, there was always another question. Could she somehow still be alive? Had someone taken her far away? Was the answer hidden in an old statement or forgotten clue? Or was the truth much closer than anyone realized? 5 years passed, then 10, then 20, then 30. The 12-year-old girl in the photographs never changed. But the world around her did. People moved. Witnesses grew older. Memories faded. And the possibility of solving the case seemed to become smaller with every passing year. Then in July 2019, everything changed. Nearly 35 years after Jonelle disappeared, workers were excavating land for a pipeline southeast of Greeley. It was the kind of work that had nothing to do with a missing person investigation. But while digging, they discovered human remains. Authorities were called to the scene. Investigators began working to identify who had been found. And soon, a family that had waited for almost 35 years received devastating confirmation. The remains belonged to Jonelle Matthews. She had finally been found. The discovery answered one question, but it immediately created another. Who had done this? And after nearly 35 years, could investigators still prove it? This is where the case took a strange turn. Because one man had already spent years drawing attention to himself in connection with Jonelle's disappearance. His name was Stephen Pankey. At the time Jonelle vanished, Pankey lived in Greeley, a few miles from the Matthews family home. He was not a friend of Jonelle's family. And for years, he was not publicly known as the central figure in the case. But Pankey had a strange relationship with the investigation. Over time, he repeatedly spoke about Jonelle's disappearance. He contacted authorities. He discussed the case. He gave interviews. And according to prosecutors, his own statements would eventually become a major part of the case against him. One statement in particular stood out. Pankey said he knew more than he wanted to know. That sentence alone did not prove he had committed a crime. And Pankey denied killing Jonelle. He said he had never met her. But investigators wanted to understand something. Why did this man keep talking about the case? And how much did he actually know? The questions became even more unusual because Pankey was not simply a forgotten name from 1984. Years later, he moved to Idaho and entered politics. He even ran for governor of Idaho. Now, decades after Jonelle vanished, a former political candidate was under growing scrutiny in connection with the case. And investigators were not finished. In September 2019, shortly after Jonelle's remains were identified, authorities searched Pankey's home in Twin Falls, Idaho. Pankey continued to deny involvement. But the investigation moved forward. Then in October 2020, more than 35 years after Jonelle disappeared, Stephen Pankey was arrested. A grand jury indicted him in connection with Jonelle's kidnapping and death. But there was a major challenge. This was not a simple case where investigators could point to one obvious piece of physical evidence and say, "There is the answer." Prosecutors did not have DNA evidence directly linking Pankey to Jonelle. Instead, the case relied heavily on circumstances, statements, behavior, and what prosecutors argued was Pankey's unusual knowledge of the crime. And that meant the outcome was far from guaranteed. Before we get to what the jury decided, if you enjoy true crime stories told clearly, without unnecessary filler, subscribe to Detective Creed. There are many cases like Jonelle's that deserve to be remembered. And the final part of this case shows just how difficult it can be to get justice after decades have passed. Pankey's first trial began in 2021. Prosecutors presented their case. The defense pushed back. Pankey maintained that he was innocent. And after all those years of waiting, the trial ended without a complete resolution. The jury could not reach a unanimous verdict on the main murder and kidnapping charges. A mistrial was declared on those counts. After nearly 35 years of mystery and arrest and a full trial, the case was still not finished. But prosecutors made a decision. They would try him again. In 2022, Stephen Pankey went before another jury. Once again, the case focused heavily on his statements and behavior. Prosecutors argued that Pankey knew details and had shown a level of interest that pointed toward something much darker. The defense maintained that the case was weak and that Pankey was innocent. This time, the jury reached a verdict. Stephen Pankey was found guilty of felony murder and second-degree kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Pankey continued to maintain his innocence. But the verdict marked the end of an extraordinary journey through the justice system. Jonelle disappeared in 1984. Her remains were found in 2019. And in 2022, nearly 38 years after she vanished, a jury convicted a man in connection with her kidnapping and death. But perhaps the most unsettling part of this story is how ordinary the night began. A Christmas concert, a ride home, a 12-year-old girl walking through her own front door. Then silence. For decades, Jonelle's family had no answer. Her face became part of a national search. Her name reached the White House. Her case survived changing investigators, fading memories, and more than 3 decades of uncertainty. And then, by chance, workers digging in a field found what investigators had been searching for since 1984.